Okay, thank you. All right, so let's go. So before we jump into the, who would like to volunteer? I would like a volunteer to tell us from session 1, what is the process? Just like in a couple of minutes, what is the process? What is the first brain part that gets activated, and then where does it go? And who can like summarize it briefly from section 1 as to what happens with when the information comes in, and from what will be the first area of the brain that gets the information, and then what is the process? Who would like to volunteer for a Starbucks card? Anybody? No volunteers? Okay, Dr. Juarez, please.
Okay, I'll give it a shot.
Okay.
So when there is new information coming in, the thalamus receives it. And I remember thalamus because I kind of call it like the alarm, and pretty much it receives that information and it sends the information to 2 places, to the cortex and to the amygdala. But it gets to the amygdala a lot quicker. And the amygdala then decides whether it is something good or bad. So it has some sort of knowledge, but it also checks in with the hippocampus. So if the hippocampus is altered, and the amygdala, by the way, is in the limbic system. Okay, so that's like your stress response, your fear response. So when it checks in with the hippocampus, if it's altered or faulty, then the hippocampus can, pretty much say, okay, that's dangerous. So it relays that information back to the what was it?
Amygdala.
Amygdala, yes, back to the amygdala. And then the amygdala sends the message to start the stress response, which is the HPA, which is the hormones something.
Hey, somebody help? Somebody help her?
It's like the mind-body connection, right? So like
isn't it hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal glands?
Perfect.
Okay, there we go. Yeah.
Excellent, very good.
Yeah, and so then that's how like the stress response starts. So I don't know, was that correct?
Excellent, very good. So there you go. So a Starbucks card is on your way.
Yay!
Yeah, all right, Dr. Holly, very good, perfect. So excellent. So again, we're not experts, but we are trying to understand what's happening. So the gateway, the initial component is the thalamus, like what she said, the sensory information. So it will get it into our system, and this is kind of like one of the triggers that we talk about. And because we know the amygdala is so short, and they call it like the fast, short pathway. So the amygdala gets it first. And then the long and slow path is the cortex, which is far away. So it's almost like we're going on the freeway or we're going on the street. So like the amygdala is the fear center that kind of tries to make sense of what information is coming in. And it gets right there so close because it's by nature is close by, and it's a fast pathway versus the cortex, which is slow and far away. And like she suggested, the amygdala has its own wisdom, as to, we talk about heights, where people don't come close to heights or snakes because it could be dangerous. But for the most part, it doesn't have the memory to remember what's bad or what's worse. So it says, let me check with the hippocampus, which is the memory center. and say, do you remember this, not this noise, or this cat, or is it a cat, or is it a lion? Is it gonna hurt me, or is something that is safe? So the hippocampus, where the memories are stored, it's gonna send a message back to the amygdala saying, it's a cat, it's our cat, it's not a big deal. So I say, okay, so then we can just relax. Whereas if the hippocampus, because of PTSD or something is not being encoded properly, it's gonna say it is a lion, it's gonna kill us, even though it's a little cat, a little cat. The amygdala then goes into the hypothalamus where the HRA responds. And how many chemicals, how many biochemical and physiological changes? How many?
Over 1,400.
1,400, both in the brain and also in the kidneys. And that's why it's the hypothalamus and the pituitary, because now it's in the kidneys. So both the brain and the body are going crazy, releasing all these chemicals that gives us all those sensations that we call them PTSD symptoms. So, it makes a lot of sense that the body is in chaos, because this is the SNS, the central nervous system, being altered, and the sympathetic nervous system being activated. And what we talked about is that the sympathetic nervous system is so sensitive that it's going to be triggered, it's going to be firing every time, because it's going to be interpreting as a dangerous when it's not. So the idea is that we introduce interventions for the parasympathetic to be stronger, so the clients can have the ability to bring down the sympathetic nervous system. So that's kind of like as far as we are. So we will continue from that point. So here we go with the continuation. I had it ready just to start.
Making it feel like you're always like hyper vigilant. I think sometimes in other workshops, they also say to give it like a week or two, I don't know, maybe like a week or something for it to arrive. I'm not totally sure. But Betsy should be able to answer questions about that. But they're doing everything electronically, which is really nice. And then somebody else was emailed asking for access to the Dropbox for the EMDR videos. And yes, since you sent me that email, I have your email and I will do that. Okay, that's all the questions I have so far from people at home. So where are we at? What are we talking about? We're talking about the neuroscience of trauma, and we're talking about areas of the brain in that yellow limbic section, that yellow limbic bridge of the brain. We talked about the thalamus. We talked about the amygdala. The amygdala, I would say, is in like the top 3 most important areas of the brain for trauma. Super important. Remember, with trauma, the issue is that it's hyperactive. So the baseline of the amygdala's activation is increased, making it feel like you're always like hyper vigilant, hyper aroused. You can't calm down, maybe you can't sleep, kind of linked to those types of symptoms. And with the amygdala, it's sensitive. It perceives threat where there is no threat. And so it spikes its activation in response to benign situations or events or things. Remember the reason though, a reason why it does this, yes, the problem is in the amygdala. Yes, we need to get the amygdala under control. A big goal of trauma treatment is to crank down the dimmer switch of the amygdala. The amygdala is not a light switch, it's a dimmer switch. So we want to begin to crank that thing down. But the issue is not just the amygdala. You could decrease the amygdala's baseline and still have issues with triggers, because one of the ways that the amygdala knows that something is dangerous is that it consults with the hippocampus, who tells the amygdala, based on past experience, this is dangerous. And so when you have PTSD or post-trauma symptoms and you're reacting to things that are benign as though they're dangerous, a lot of times it's a hippocampal problem. We ended at break. Before really going into detail about how this thing works, there's a lot of things about this I want to tell you about. Understanding the hippocampus will allow you to understand why you do exposure anything, why you do exposure work, why you do memory reconsolidation work, why you might be doing narrative therapy, why talk therapy or why cognitive therapy in some instances can be helpful. So I want to describe this area of the brain to you and tell you a few things about it. So the hippocampus, the center for explicit, declarative, autobiographical memories, the stuff that you can actually remember, like your cat when it walks across the floor and you can recognize it as your cat. That's the hippocampus. The hippocampus has a very big memory capacity. So in long-term memory, a million different things could be stored in the files of the hippocampus. The hippocampus doesn't really come online until about 2.5, 3. You have to be about 2.5 or 3 before it'll start coming online. That's why you don't probably remember details of your life when you were 3 months old. Okay? You don't really have the hippocampus at that point. Slow developing through childhood and adolescence, where memory gets better with time. And here's how the hippocampus works when it's working well. So when the hippocampus is working well, it is big, volume-wise. It's a large structure, and it's online. It's activated. So with the amygdala, we don't want like a lot of amygdala activation minute to minute unless you're actually in a dangerous situation. But with the hippocampus, we do want high activation. More activated, usually the better. So we want a hippocampus that's big and online. When it's big and it's online, it does better at encoding memories. It does it better. What the hippocampus is interested in is emotional stuff, emotional material. Yeah, so does it only store memories of your own experiences, or can it be something that you watched or read? Yeah, it can be something that you watched or read. It can even be memory of a fear that never happened. You have a fear of bees and you were never stung, but you had this fear of a bee and now you remember that. So yeah, you can remember anything, any experience that you have. Yeah, the fear of the bee could be that mom was afraid of bees and she modeled that and now you're afraid of bees. So that could have been communicated. Yeah, a million different ways. That can be stored there too. It loves emotional stuff. So if there's something that you experience or see or touch, some situation that you don't have any emotional reaction to, you probably won't remember it. The hippocampus does not care as much. It likes the emotional stuff, especially the negative emotional stuff, because that could be relevant to survival. But the good stuff too, the hippocampus cares about. The more emotional, the more it tends to care about things. So the more emotional something is, the more you're likely to remember it. Think about it like this. Emotion signals salience in the brain. Emotion tells the brain what's important to hold on to and what's not. So when something's emotional, it's signaling to the brain, hey, don't forget this. This is really important. Don't forget this. Kind of relating that to therapy. When a client comes in and they're anxious about something and they say, I just need this thought to go away. This thought, I can't stand this thought. We just need to get this thought to go away. And they're having this really strong emotional reaction to the thought. Like that's like most of the problem right there. That they're having this strong emotional reaction to the thought, which the hippocampus is like, oh, she's freaking out about this thought. Yeah, we can't forget that. That must be really important. If she's thinking, like she's feeling so much about this thought. So that's why in therapies like acceptance and commitment therapy, anybody doing that, doing ACT work, you're changing the way you relate to thoughts. And so we have these exercises that sometimes are kind of funny, but these cognitive exercises where you're kind of neutralizing these thoughts so that when you have that really distressing thought, you're just like, there's that thought again. And you don't have an emotional reaction to it. And the more that you decrease your emotional reaction to a thought, the more it goes away over time. Now it's a gradual decrease, but if you really want a thought to go away, you have to stop reacting to it. Eventually, your brain won't hold on to it anymore and you won't be having it as much, but it's a gradual process. Okay, yeah, so hippocampus holds on to the emotional stuff. When it's processing things well, it's big and it's online. So here's an example. Maybe it's a birthday that you had, a birthday party from a few years back. Let's say it's like 5 years ago. What would that be? So it's like June of 2014. You had this birthday party. And what the hippocampus does when it encodes this memory of your birthday party is it takes a panoramic view. It's kind of like it's a camera taking a picture, and it takes this panoramic view of the situation with a lot of contextual details. So it doesn't just take a picture of just the candle on the cake or just some guy's fork or somebody's shoe, or It's a contextual picture, like a panoramic picture. And it takes the picture very still. Like if you're taking it with your phone, it'd be like holding a camera very, very still as opposed to shaky camera, right? If your phone is shaking or you're moving, the picture ends up blurred. So that's not the way it works when it's working well. Hippocampus, clear, panoramic, still picture. Now that doesn't mean when you remember it that you remember it like a photographic memory. Most of us don't have that. Every time you remember something, you actually recreate it. So it's not a perfect analogy, but that's kind of what it's like. So when it's a clear picture, you can tell what's what, and you can put things in relation to other things in this panoramic view. Then what it does is it prints out this picture, old school style, like when you used to go to Walgreens and you used to actually print pictures and we'd have physical, we don't really do that as much anymore. But when you get pictures developed, on the back, there would be a timestamp. Okay, that's also what the hippocampus does. So it takes this panoramic picture, it's clear, it prints it out. On the back, it puts 2 timestamps on the picture. One timestamp is about when this happened, so June of 2014. And the other timestamp is about how long that thing lasted. So, okay, that lasted like maybe 2 hours at that restaurant, let's say. So Bessel van der Kolk calls the hippocampus the timekeeper of the brain. It's one of the things that it does. And that's a well-working memory system right there. That's a well-working hippocampus. And if you could encode everything just like that, you wouldn't have any hippocampal issues. And I would argue that your PTSD wouldn't be so bad. It wouldn't be as severe if that's all it did. Okay, so that's a well-working hippocampus. So what goes wrong in trauma where all of a sudden the hippocampus is sending information back to the amygdala that something's dangerous, even when it's not? Why is it giving that message? So let's talk about what happens during trauma to the hippocampus. It's not just during trauma, it's during stress. So when you're under stress, and the worse the stress, the more this gets magnified. But when you're in a stressful situation, the hippocampus does not process information in the same way. I'm not going to say it's inaccurate, it's different. So what happens is that when you're in a very stressful situation or experiencing a trauma, the hippocampus oftentimes, depends on the person and the context and the situation, but oftentimes what will happen is that the hippocampus can't fully activate the way it needs to. Remember, when it's very big and it's activated, it encodes memories well. Well, it turns out during toxic stress, during trauma, it can't fully activate. So it might just be pieces of it that activate instead of the whole thing. This means that it might start to make errors in memory encoding, encodes things a little differently. The reason why this happens, we actually know, like, it's been verified. We know why this happens. The reason why this happens is because of the presence of cortisol. So remember, we talked about cortisol as that stress hormone, where when you're stressed out, your body goes into that stress response, 1,400 biochemical reactions. Cortisol is one of them. When you're stressed or when you're experiencing a trauma, cortisol is flooding your body and your brain. It just so happens that cortisol floods into the hippocampus because the hippocampus is covered in cortisol receptors. Just so happens. So this structure of the brain covered in cortisol receptors. So it acts as a sort of magnet to cortisol. So when you're stressed or when you're traumatized, that cortisol floods into the hippocampus. And when it floods into the hippocampus, it prevents it from fully activating. It's actually destructive to the hippocampus. So now you got this cortisol flooding this hippocampus and it can't activate the way it normally does. And in the short term, in that moment, it can create some errors in memory encoding. Also then, if you have something like GAD or PTSD, and you got like a lot of cortisol all the time flooding your system, and you got a lot of cortisol flooding the hippocampus all the time, what happens over time is that the cortisol will eat away at the hippocampus. It will atrophy. And you can see on brain scans, the hippocampus virtually disappearing to nothing. So you can shrink the hippocampus with the cortisol eating it away. I know you might be sitting there kind of worried now. You're like, I'm kind of stressed about my brain being eaten away by cortisol. the more I'm stressed, the more my brain is eaten away by cortisol. Like this is like a vicious cycle. I know. Don't worry. It's going to be, I'm trying to think about where this is in the slide, but it's going to be a much later slide, but we're going to talk about neurogenesis, or growing brand new cells in this area of the brain. You are not just out of luck. Okay, this is an area of the brain where there can be a lot of repair work done here. Okay, so know that it's actually fairly straightforward the way you do it. I think this will be on the slide, but to cut to the chase, exercise, omega-3s, meditation. Omega-3 is the diet. I don't know why meditation, but meditation helps with neurogenesis in this area. The other thing is going to be good old-fashioned exercise, 20, 30 minutes a day, 3 times a week. If you can incorporate novel movement, all the better, or novel scenery. So if you're going to be, jogging, it's better to not just stare at a brick wall. It's better to get outside. If you can incorporate dance or yoga or Tai Chi or something with movement, different types of movements, even better. The brain loves novelty. It'll grow new connections with this. So don't worry. We'll talk a little more about this later, but you can regrow the hippocampus. You're not totally screwed, but this is what happens to people over time. So when somebody comes to my office, they're like, I've had anxiety for 30 years and I'm here because I think I've got dementia. I'm pretty sure I have Alzheimer's. One question you may want to ask them is, are other people concerned about this too? Or is it just you? Because if they have Alzheimer's, other people have been worried long before they're ever worried. Other people see it. If they're the only ones worried, yeah, I can get you a neuropsych eval. You can do that. But how many times have we seen neuropsych evals come back with go to therapy in your recommendation section? There's a reason. Yeah, you might have some cognitive deficits, you might have some memory issues, but if you have really severe PTSD, that's probably why. Okay, so getting treatment can really be helpful with that. Okay, so hippocampus, it will not fully activate under times of intense stress or trauma because of cortisol, prevents the hippocampus from fully activating, and the hippocampus might start to make memory encoding errors. So what might they be? Depends on the person, depends on the context and the situation, depends on the age of the person. I'm not saying that these things always happen with everyone, but here are some things that can happen. One thing is that instead of taking a panoramic picture, now you're taking little like close up fragmented pictures. Remember, we talked about stress in the body, that autonomic stress response and physical correlates. I said one of the things that happens is tunnel vision, and you zoom in on the threat. That's the picture it takes. Zooms in on the gun in somebody else's hand. Okay, zooms in on details that the hippocampus, for whatever reason, thinks are important. And they might sometimes be obviously important, like looking at a weapon, but they could also be other things that you wouldn't necessarily think are important. Who knows how the decisions always get made, but it's fragments. This is also why trauma memories can be fragmented. And you don't know what goes with what, or what came first or what came next. It's just these fragments that can play through your mind. Another thing that sometimes can happen, oh yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. So yes, that happens a lot in trauma where, yeah, people will remember things kind of in fragments and they might try to fill in the gaps or make sense of it or pull it together in some way, but the memories themselves might be might be fragmented. And people will struggle sometimes with that, like that they don't remember everything. They don't remember all the pieces, or they have the fragments and they don't know which order they go in. That's a common thing too. Yeah. Oh yeah. So yeah, they might focus on one fragment and that's like all of the truth you're saying. Yeah, like that's the whole experience when really there were other things. That's where something called cognitive processing therapy can be helpful to contextualize. Okay, yeah. She's saying during the trauma, what's the chances of having memory loss like right after the trauma and then eventually getting the memory back? Okay. Yeah, okay. So she's saying that that in the case of a trauma survivor that experienced a mass shooting, she ended up being carried out of the situation, and she remembers a lot of the situation, but doesn't remember that piece of actually being, I guess, rescued or carried out of the situation. That piece is gone. Okay, is she ever going to regain that, I guess, is the question. Okay, so it can happen. It won't always happen. It totally depends on why the memory loss is there. So it could be that through a process like EMDR, that a lot of times with EMDR, people will start with fragments and then all of a sudden it gets a little richer and they get a little more and they get a little more. So things will start to come back sometimes. So if her hippocampus got a hold of that information, if it ever got to the hippocampus, then it's probably in there somewhere, then she'll probably remember it eventually. If the information never got to the hippocampus, then she will never remember it. Okay, so let me describe how this would work. I didn't describe this piece of it. So remember when I talked about how when information reaches the thalamus, it goes to the amygdala and it also goes to these thinking areas, right? 2 routes. What I didn't tell you is that with the thalamus, sending the information to these thinking logical areas of the brain, after it hits these areas, after it's processed by these areas, it actually loops down to the hippocampus. Okay, and so that's when you decide to store something in memory or not. So if information can go from the thalamus uninterrupted up to these thinking areas, loop down into the hippocampus, then it's in there and she can probably eventually get that memory back. If something disrupted the signal going from the thalamus to the cortical area to the hippocampus, if something cut that signal where it never gets to the hippocampus, there is no memory for it. It will never be retrieved. The reason why that would happen, remember in the DSM-5, there's that one symptom, amnesia for an important piece of the memory, not attributable to alcohol use or TBI. And it's not amnesia for some peripheral detail, it's some amnesia for an important piece, which that could be a very important piece, right? Actually being rescued. What happens? Remember that information goes from the spinal cord to the thalamus routes it to the amygdala, and at the same time, the thalamus routes that same information to go up here, but remember it's slow coming up here. So the amygdala is processing that information while the signal is floating upward very, very slowly. If the amygdala, when it gets a hold of that information, decides that it is really bad, I mean, this is like really, really severe trauma, and it activates a whole ton, like really activates very, very, very strongly. Remember, it sends signals up to suppress these areas. Well, the amygdala has the power to not only suppress these areas, but to cut them off completely, to shut them down completely. If the amygdala, while that signal from the thalamus is trucking up, if the amygdala is like, oh my gosh, we need to shut the whole thing down, it will cut the signal that's traveling from the thalamus up here. It will never be processed. You will never remember it. Does that kind of make sense? You will never remember it. Don't worry, you can still do EMDR, even because you might be thinking, well, what if somebody has amnesia for the whole trauma? Like what if they don't have any memory? How would you even do anything? Because you probably can't do prolonged exposure. You can't do the traditional type of EMDR where you're focusing on a memory. What you then have to do is probably really focus on the body, because even though the cortex, the hippocampus don't have any memory of it, it never reached these areas, it did reach the amygdala, it did reach the body. Okay, so the trauma is here down. So you just don't have access to it here. So you have to work here down. So in EMDR, what that means is you do something called somatic targeting. So you identify where the trauma is felt in the body or how it's activated in the body. It might be a feeling in the gut. It might be a tightening of the chest. You just focus on the physical sensations and you work with that trauma network through that, because there is no memory that goes with it. Yeah.
So would this be relative and related to children who experience trauma prior to the
Pre-verbal trauma. Yep. So this would be what you do for pre-verbal trauma. It can, yeah, absolutely can be. Yep. So anytime there's not an explicit memory because you were too young or because that signal is cut, you're going to have to take a little bit of a different approach. So with kids, trauma-focused CBT, you're not going to be able to do all of trauma-focused CBT because it's depending on the fact that you remember it. But if you don't, then you have to do something a little bit different. Again, this is where the somatic approaches become more important. Yeah, but to answer the question, is she going to remember? Who knows? It depends on what actually happened and why she's not remembering. Sure. So what happens if somebody doesn't remember a trauma, but then does remember it, but the way they remember it is that they have a physical sensation and then they remember it. So how does that happen? Easy answer to this. Trauma is stored in networks. We're going to talk a lot about networks in your brain, just a way to conceptualize trauma and how it works. So trauma is in networks, these themes, every network, you have a network for your dog, you have a network for, you know, human beings in general, you have a separate network for your spouse. I mean, we have all these neural networks that are organized according to themes. Trauma networks include memories, if they're there, of bad things that have happened. They also include emotions, people, places, situations, smells, sensations. So to activate a trauma network, oftentimes all you have to do is have one point of entry. So it might just be one physical sensation, one smell, boom, the whole thing's activated. And when the whole thing gets activated, you're more likely then to remember the memories that are in that network. That's how it gets activated. That's also why, like with something like EMDR, people start remembering stuff that they didn't remember before, or even just being in therapy. I have one guy that says that all of a sudden he's remembering his childhood. He's like, I don't remember any of my childhood at first. And now as we're doing more therapy, we're not even doing like trauma focused anything yet, but something about just focusing on himself and some stuff of the past. He's remembering all this stuff from his childhood, not necessarily bad stuff, but just things are coming back. Yeah, so that happens.
I had a soft child who was badly traumatized and that had to do a natural rape. And I wore a new scent one day and he freaked. That has been body memory.
Yeah, that's sensory memory. Yeah, okay, so she's saying that she wore a different perfume one day and a client totally freaked out about this. It was really triggering to them. Yeah, so that was unwittingly activating a trauma network. Nothing's going to be so strong as a smell. Smells are the most powerful way to activate. And the reason why is because, remember, sensory information goes through the thalamus, all sensory information, but not smell. Smell actually goes directly to the amygdala. So smell is the most potent, like, sense that we have. Like, it's the strongest one that we have. Nothing will send somebody into a flashback faster than a smell. So yeah, smells are especially important. Yeah. That happens. Yeah. Oh God. Okay. So what she's saying is her mother had a very long, horrible childhood trauma, like many traumatic experiences. And then her father ended up committing suicide. It wasn't until her 40s that she remembered all the stuff from childhood. And now she's, you said, dying of vascular dementia. Yeah. I mean, in terms of remembering things in your 40s, I see it all the time. I mean, I have like my own theories about why that is, but it's always that decade. It seems like that's when you see people and all of a sudden people are remembering stuff and the PTSD is surfacing. I think some of this has to do with that decade being kind of a creative decade, actually, where you're making progress, usually in your career, you're intelligent in kind of a different way. And you're in something called, we're not talking about this so much in this workshop, but your brain goes into this network a lot more called default mode network, which is the mind wandering network. And when your mind wanders, that's how you come up with creative ideas, is you kind of draw loose associations between things and your mind is sort of floating and you're sort of daydreaming. That happens a lot in that decade. And that's also the same network that you go into when you dissociate. So I think sometimes as they're going into that mind wandering, stuff starts coming back up about trauma. That's just me talking. That's my guess. So I see a lot of people in that decade coming in for stuff that they're just remembering. In terms of the vascular dementia, geez, I can't draw like a particular link necessarily, but I could see how potentially experiencing strong trauma reactions, PTSD reactions. I mean, we know that that is linked to that. We know that long-term hippocampal damage can predict earlier onset of dementia. So that would be the main link I would think about. Yeah. 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 How does this relate to research on recovered memories? Could you be more specific? Loftus's research, yeah, just basically that they're false. Some recovered memories will be false. Yeah, are you asking if it can happen, or what do you? Yeah, you can definitely implant memories. Hypnosis is going to be the main way to do it. Were you going to add something to it? Yeah, right. So things aren't adding up with what you're talking about with your mom's memories, that some of them might, yeah. And I'll tell you that that's not really my area of expertise. I will tell you that in EMDR consent forms, you have them say they're not in litigation, they're not going through any legal anything, because there's been no evidence that I know of indicating that EMDR would produce like false memories. But anytime you're working directly with memories are so malleable that if it's like, you know, a murder trial or something, you want to be really careful about any sort of memory work that you're doing. But again, I don't know of any instances where EMDR has caused memories that weren't there. I think when I think about that, I always think about hypnosis as being the main thing. Like if I refer somebody to a hypnotist, I always tell them to record the session in case anybody ever needed to go back later and analyze what was being done, because that's the primary way through suggestion. I think memories get kind of implanted. Although I think with kids, it's done a lot easier than that, just through repeated suggestion. That's why it's considered like child abuse to repeatedly suggest to your kid that they're being abused when they're not being abused, because it'll actually make that memory happen. So yeah, it's a really good question. The hippocampus won't know the difference though, by the way. Like once it's there, like it won't know. It's gonna think things are real. Okay, so back to this concept of hippocampal errors. So it can be that instead of taking a panoramic picture, it's taking like the little fragmented pictures. It can also then take fuzzy pictures. Instead of taking a really clear picture, it can be like a shaky camera, and it might take some pictures that are fuzzy. This is problematic because when you see a fuzzy picture of something, it's open to interpretation. So this little clicker thing, like depending, like if you took it out of context, you didn't know how big it was, it could look like a building or a clicker, or in some angles a gun maybe. I mean, it could be like a million different things if it's fuzzy and you take the context away, right? That leads to generalization of fear. And I'll give an example of this in a minute to make this more clear, but that leads to generalization of fear. So now the hippocampus will respond to the amygdala that something is dangerous if it just shares one element in common with this, because if it's fuzzy, you don't really know what it is. The other errors that it might make will be, it might forget to put the timestamp, one or more of the timestamps on. If it forgets the timestamp that tells you how long you were there, then you won't know. Just like me and the tarantula, I'm guessing 2 or 3 years. Obviously that's impossible. But I have no idea. So that timestamp wasn't included, so I have no idea. That's a very, very common thing with very stressful events, to not have that timestamp. There's even been research looking at ER physicians, just in stressful moments in the ER where they're trying to save someone's life, and they have the doctors estimate how long they were there, and they're off by a lot. And it's usually that they think they were there for like 5 minutes and it was like 45 minutes or something. Like they're way off in their time perception. The other error that can be made is not putting the timestamp on, telling you when something happened. And if that's the case, then memories won't age. And so instead of remembering a memory, you relive it. This is the re-experiencing symptom, the intrusiveness symptoms. So when I think about that horrible event, I'm back in it. Like I feel like my body's reacting like it's happening to me all over again. So that's a timekeeper problem. That's a hippocampus problem. I saw a hand over here. Yeah, it's a distortion of time during trauma. Yeah, so it's hard to really know. And again, not everybody has all of these hippocampal errors all the time, but these are the things that can happen. So you see why maybe people don't want to talk about their trauma, because when they talk about it, they relive it. Why they might have problems giving exact information about this happened and I was here for this amount of time and then I went here and then this happened, because that's not the way it's encoded a lot of times. Let me give an example that kind of highlights this generalization of fear. You may remember way back in the day, a study called the Little Albert study. Remember this, Little Albert? I don't remember when the study was, years and years ago. Little Albert was this like 2 or 3-year-old, this cute little kid. And it was a conditioning study. It was a behavioral study. And they would bring little Albert into the lab and they would show him white fluffy bunnies. And then they would make a loud sound above his head to make him scared. And the question was, if we pair the loud sound with this bunny that he loves, will he eventually come to fear the bunny? Yeah, right. I mean, this kid's hippocampus like doesn't exist yet. Like there's no chance of encoding it right? There's no chance of that. So bring the kid into the lab. Oh, look, the white fluffy bunny, whack, some loud sound. He startles, he cries, and then they just repeat it over and over again. Sure enough, I know little Albert needed an attorney at the end of this. I don't know. Needed to hire himself somewhere. Eventually, they would show him the bunny and he would just start to cry. Okay. So if little Albert's hippocampus were able at that age, which again, it's like hopeless, but if his brain was able to encode it correctly, it would have encoded it like this. Mom puts me in the car seat. We go to that building. We go and we go into that room with that jerk in the white lab coat over there. When I'm sitting at that table and in that context, they bring the white bunny over. It's scary because they make a sound and I'm scared. That would be correct encoding. So then if he was outside in the backyard and saw a bunny and his amygdala is like, hey, what's that? The hippocampus would say, okay, well, we're not in the context of that lab and that jerk in the white lab coat. So bunnies are okay. So yeah, that's okay right now. Okay. And it would give correct information. The bunny's not dangerous. That's not the way his brain encoded it. The way his brain encoded this situation was white, fluffy, bad. Close-up picture of the white bunny, losing the contextual detail that says only in that circumstance is this bad. Instead, it's just white, fluffy, bad. And it's not even such a clear picture as to be a bunny. It's just this muffled, kind of blurry picture of white and fluffy. So now anything that's white and fluffy, he's afraid of. So reportedly, he could not do Santa Claus because the Santa Claus beard was white and fluffy. Okay, so now you like lose that. You lose bubble baths. Any rabbit, any bunny in any context is super, super threatening. You open up the cabinet door in the bathroom and it's a bag of white cotton balls and the amygdala is like, what's that? And the hippocampus is like, oh my gosh, you got to run. You got to get out of there. That's white and fluffy, starts crying. So that's generalization of fear. That's what's happening a lot of times in PTSD, where you have people responding to situations or people or things as though they're dangerous and they're not. So you have somebody coming back from Iraq, being in combat, and they can't go to the store. They can't go somewhere where there's going to be people of Middle Eastern descent. Now, all those people get put into that category. You start to kind of see how the generalization happens. And it seems to be the case that without treatment, the generalization gets bigger, not smaller. Without treatment, it's going to get worse with time. This is a good reason, a good motivator to get help. I've been a telemental health psychologist in the past at the VA, where my job was to do PTSD treatment, calling into very rural areas of the state. And I would see the worst PTSD because these people were like barricaded themselves on like 30 acres with a ton of guns, and they hadn't gone to the grocery store in 15 years. I mean, they were very isolated. And that generalization of fear, that isolation had gotten that bad over time, and it definitely correlated with other symptoms. Those were the worst PTSD cases I ever saw. And what had happened though, they didn't start like that. It started with, I came home and I just didn't like crowds, because in war, you know, if you're in a crowd, you're a sitting duck. So you just don't want to be in a crowd. So I didn't go to music concerts. And then I started noticing Walmart at 5 p.m. on a Friday. There's just too many people. Everybody's going. But then all of a sudden, grocery shopping at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday didn't feel good. And then when I go out to check my mail, I just felt unsafe checking my mail. So you see how it gets bigger with time. And now they're isolated. So, and you'll see that too with people with maybe a driving phobia, how it tends to go in the direction of like agoraphobia for some people. So getting help is going to help with this. There seems to be something about this where it gets worse. So these are the errors that are possible. So you can see how this is problematic when the amygdala depends on the hippocampus to tell it what's dangerous. So yes, it's an amygdala problem, but it is a hippocampus problem. Relating this to exposure therapy. So what we're trying to do with exposure therapy and a lot of like narrative therapy, even just like talk therapy, where people are talking about things that are distressing, what we're really having them do is we're having them take the file out of the hippocampus. So let's say it's, you give the example of someone who, this is a real client who, the reason why he came to therapy is that he had been in my private practice. He had gone to Afghanistan in like 2011. I don't know if you know anything about Afghanistan around that time. That was a bad time to be there. And this was true in Afghanistan and Iraq, where if you're driving down the way, if you see trash in the road, it's probably an IED, right? This is how IEDs are kind of hidden. And so back in Kansas, on the highway, if there was anything, little thing in the middle of the road, even however tiny, and he could spot anything, he would automatically swerve, not even think about it. He would do that. Almost been in several accidents doing this. So he's like, I need to stop swerving. It's a hard thing, right? Because by the time you realize you've done it, you've already done it. The amygdala is already fired. It's already taken action. So what we had to do in therapy is take out of the hippocampus these times in the past when it was dangerous to have trash in the road. And so he would think about these times, and we would do exercises through neuromodulation. We did a little bit of EMDR work too, where he trained himself to relax a lot more with these memories. So he's changing his emotional relationship with these memories of trash in the road. He's bringing that arousal down a little bit. Okay, so trash in the road, not as scary. He paired that with statements like, this is it was 2018 at the time. This is 2018. This is Kansas. Trash in the road does not mean an IED. And at first it did nothing. When he would drive, he'd swerve. But through repeated exposure to this, repeatedly taking it out of the hippocampus, reworking it, calming the physiology down, restructuring it cognitively, storing it back in the hippocampus, what happened through repeated working with it is that, remember, when you remember something, you're always recreating it. You're shifting it a little bit. So we'd take it out, we'd work it with it a little bit, and then we'd put it back into the hippocampus, a little bit different than what it was before. And you do this over and over again, where you're getting calmer and calmer and calmer. And after a while, he's driving down the road, he sees something in the road, and he feels really tense, but he doesn't actually swerve. It feels really overwhelming. And then after a while, he gets a little bit calmer. And it takes a few months, but that's the idea. So what we're doing through repeated exposure or through repeated working with material, we're taking it out of the hippocampus. We're actually bringing it up here to this area, this prefrontal cortex, which we'll talk about. This is working memory. We're bringing it into working memory. We're changing it in some way. And it might even be just somebody who has a good relationship with you, where there's a lot of trust, just sitting there talking to you. They feel contained and they feel in a safe space. And it's a little bit less scary to talk about it now, just because it's with you. That even changes the emotional relationship with the material. You put it back in and you do this over and over again. And eventually the hippocampus gives a different message back to the amygdala when the amygdala asks. Does that make sense? This is like the basis of memory reconsolidation work, exposure therapy, and honestly, just good old fashioned talk therapy. It's what you're trying to do. Of course, then it really relies on that trust though, right? That you've created a good safe space in therapy. So it's not
Okay, so very good. This is a perfect time to pause because this is exactly what I'm doing with Angel, and it making a lot of sense. So we have the Angel case with Sarah. Angel has the tunnel vision of the gun. That's all he remembers, the gun. So when she's talking about this, it's kind of like really putting me into the understanding of what I'm seeing in clinical practice. And what I'm doing with him is the same thing, exposure. I take him because remember, he was at a bus stop, a, a, a car drove by, and the guy took out a gun and just pointed at him. This is a 14, 15-year-old kid who was at a bus stop, and the car just drove by, and the guy pulled a gun, and he just saw the gun and panicked. So right now, like she was saying, he started avoiding going out to school. He started going out with the family. He started going out to the store. Now it's almost like he cannot go anywhere. Even to come here is a big challenge because he cannot go anywhere. So he's doing, home studies where he doesn't even go and turn in his work at school because he cannot even go. To, like I said, just to come here, it's a whole process. So when I take him into the bus stop and I told him this is the second time I took him, he gave me like a 9 or 8 just thinking about it. I remember before that, remember how I presented the on video. We didn't take him out on video. I found a clip of a news with a guy taking out a gun. The police were looking for him, so we watched it, and I do the scaling, and then I did the breathing exercises, and I brought him back. So I was giving him that ability to regulate his distress level. So we did a couple of sessions like that. When I felt that he had the capacity and the trust with me, then I told him, I'm gonna take you out into a bus stop. And obviously when I told him, he freaked out. It was like a 7 or 8, kind of reintroduced the exercises, brought it down to a 5 or something. Then I took him to the bench. While we were at the bench, kind of really anxious. I gave him a stress ball. He's like going crazy with the stress ball. And then we started talking, and I took him into, okay, what are you seeing? I'm seeing a lot of cars. What are you hearing? I see the noises. What are you smelling? I smell some food because there was a restaurant close by. And remember, like I liked what they said about the point of entry. The smell is the strongest. So I said, like, what is your senses? What are you smelling? And it's close to the Tacatis right here. It smells really good. So I said, oh, it smells really good. Yeah, enjoy the smell. And this safe environment, and it's giving a different sensation, a different experience. So kind of like with that exposure, trying to exchange the experience, and we were going through he's into cars, and so am I. Like, okay, what's your favorite car? What is it? Why is that? Fast cars, sports car, like kind of like we were looking at the car because remember every car now that he saw, he will be like, as soon as he came out, he saw a car, kind of watching out for the car because they were saying the generalization of fear, like every car or any car could give him that trigger. So now we were looking at the cars and appreciating the different elements of the car to give him a different sensation. And she was saying, putting these memories back into the hippocampus with a different context, that cars are nice, cars are enjoyable. Um, so with repeated exposure and having a different experience every time and getting into those neural networks where the trauma is, trying to get into there through this experience and putting it back into the hippocampus with a different experience. Kind of like if we do that repeatedly, that's that's kind of like the emphasis that you begin to tell the amygdala that it's okay, that cars don't represent a threat. It's not every car is gonna hurt you. And so that's kind of like more or less what I'm trying to do. What is interesting from this training is that I like how she explains how the hippocampus can make these errors. And we see it like, if the memory doesn't have a stamp of when it happened and how long it happened, people begin to relieve it's almost going back to the incident or the trauma, right? Or if it's a fuzzy picture, then you begin to put in information that is wrong. And then that's how you become to generalize fear. Or let's see here, if it's gaps, you begin to make a wrong story about the trauma. And so this is kind of like what I'm rescuing from the training. And it made me think about the case. Remember Dr. Juarez about false memories? Remember they talk about false memories, and I know with your client, it came out like something came up, when we were doing EMDR. And it's like we're not suggesting and we're not creating memories. They're just there. They just happen to be activated when we are doing the reprocessing. So she was suggesting that perhaps in hypnosis you can, create or suggest memories, but in EMDR, so far as I in my practice or from my studying, that's not something that is usually a case for EMDR. So more or less, that's kind of like those are the main points. Like remember, the sense of smell is the strongest to get into those neural networks where the traumas are. So you have to be very aware that if there's a sensation with the smell, that we don't get re-triggered, or if there is the case and you want to do it, like I say, it was a fire. And then whenever there's smoke, smell, the client begins to get triggered. So I would like, if I had a client like that, I would like introduce this bottom up, and she called it somatic. Remember how the amygdala has the ability to shut down the cortex? That was a very interesting point too. Remember how the thalamus perceives the information. If the amygdala senses that, oh my God, we're gonna die, it shuts down the cortex. It has the ability to shut it down and send all these reactions to the body. So the only point of entry will be with a bottom-up intervention, a somatic-based intervention. So you're not gonna do a lot of cog-B. You're gonna be doing more like whether it's centering or relaxing or kind of like a body focused intervention, because that's the entry into the memory, not through cog-B, because it never made it to the cortex because the amygdala shut it down. That's so interesting that the amygdala will have the ability to shut down the pathway to the cortex. So that's why it makes no sense. All right, so what else did you rescue? Who else, what was fascinating, or what do you think was a good concept of the learning? Please, Marilyn.
I thought it was fascinating that you can recover from all that cortisol going into your body, that because this is where I practice myself, neurogenesis, where you can exercise and do meditation, and I love meditation and dance and yoga and all of that. So I literally said to myself, oh my God, I'm saved. Because I started to worry about that. I'm like, oh my goodness, it's hard not to,
So your hippocampus is not being destroyed, or what do they call it, atrophy, right?
Let's hope not.
And I like the explanation, because I knew about little Albert. That's a study that we all learn in grad school. But now it makes a lot of sense. Like, look, the hippocampus doesn't get activated or fully or developed until 2 or 3. That's why we don't have memories of when we were 1 or 2. You know,
Yeah.
we begin to have memories. It makes a lot of sense. We begin to have memories of when we were like 3 or 4, but prior to that, we don't recall. I see pictures of myself as a baby. I don't remember having that little toy, or because when you're before 2 or 3, we don't have that capacity to store memories. So I like the explanation of little Albert and this concept of generalization of fear, which we know that happens in PTSD with my client with the cars. Now all the cars are bad. All the cars are going to hurt him. So I like that concept too. So yes.
Can I recommend the, remember I told you I was reading this book about sensory motor therapy. That's what it is. She specializes in body techniques. And I read it because when I took the EMDR training, I realized that that was very important because like this lady said, you know, sometimes you don't remember, you don't have memory of things that happened to you. So then you go to the body. So that I really got, you know, I really get it.
Yeah, and then when we go into the area of interventions, we're going to extend on the different interventions. And like I said, I'm planning on developing an important combination of body work. We'll see how we get it done. I know that we might need to come together, you know, for some exercises, you know, that for mindfulness. Estela?
Yes, there is also a good book, and it says the body keeps the score, by Bessel van der Kolk, and it's excellent. And when this lady was talking about that, I'm like, the body keeps the score, and that's true.
By the way, I had a training. If you're interested, it's part of PESI. I have a training on the body keeps the score. So it's still available if you want to go through the.
Yes, please.
Okay, so I'll give you my login information so you can actually go into, if you want to go into the neuroscience of complex trauma, or if you want to go into, I have several. So I'll give you my login information, and you can go and look at the videos, and you can do everything except take the exams because I already took them. You know?
Can you send it
So,
to me, please?
yeah, so I will send you my PESI login information. And Dr. Juarez, you had a question or a comment? Sorry,
I don't remember. No, it's fine. No, it's fine. I completely forgot.
all right, so I'll send you my PESI login, and then you can decide what you want to go into. There's multiple. I have a cognitive behavioral therapy certification program. I have the body keeps score, this, and I have others that you can actually go into it. What else was relevant or important, or was, you know, that you remember from what we just went through?
I really appreciated in regards to like the somatic piece of what Estela was talking about, that that kids, because they may not have that memory or maybe even the words. I was just interested in thinking about Diana with all or Dr. Vera when she works with all the kids, and if yeah, how that treatment is a lot different. And then what was the other part? Let's see. Oh, and where she said that kids could be like traumatized through suggestion, so kind of like through hypnosis, but like through consistent suggestion. So it makes me think about my clients, the ones who had been coached by their father, letting them know that their mother had done so much to them and they ended up like hating her. So it reminds me of like, wow, how much trauma that could have cost to these kids and their memories of mom.
Mhm. That's an excellent point, and we have seen that in several cases. So now with PCIT, and now knowing that the hippocampus perhaps is not fully developed by now, what is understanding that? How do you interpret what's going on and what you're trying to do? Dr. Vera?
I think I would just say something similar to what happened to little Albert is just part of like the conditioning that they have. And I think part of it is like the Snapchats that they discussed about, you know, like just taking pictures of it. Because it also made me remember a client that Sarah sent to me or transferred to me before she left about being sexually abused. And I remember when we were discussing like at the end about her triggers, one of her triggers that came out was the Aunt Jemima syrup, because the abuse happened in the morning and the only thing she could see as she was being abused was an Aunt Jemima syrup. So it wasn't the syrup itself, but it was just that brand. And it made me it made me connect that it was that Snapchat or that just image of like the table and the Aunt Jemima, and not necessarily like the abuse or the perpetrator, but those Snapchats that they're talking about. So I think it's kind of similar with the kids. They focus on certain things. For example, if parents will get mad at them and would send them to the restroom, they don't remember the whole part of like, porque no hiciste caso, por eso te metimos al baño and you had your timeout. It's just the bathroom itself that becomes the trigger. So I think that's where they get connected. I mean, that's my hypothesis. I don't really have an answer, but from what they're telling us, I mean, that's where I'm making these connections.
But it makes a lot of sense. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to understand the science of the brain and so that I can understand better what my clients' presentations, you know, so trying to understand more why this client had this generalized fear, why this client was relieving, you know, and the good thing for me is that because I do EMDR, which is really kind of like we go into directly into the hippocampus, you know, we almost bypass the amygdala and, you know, through the EMDR, once you like fully, when you're doing the reprocessing and desensitization process, you're actually almost inside of their brain. You know, all their defenses are kind of removed, or, you know, kind of, you know how like all the defense mechanisms and, you know, cognitive distortions and all the stuff, you're almost like you already went past them and you're actually right there. And that's what happened to her client, that when we were right there, this image, it almost like she saw it. She saw the face of the guy that she didn't remember. That, you know, somehow I believe that it was more like a defense mechanism where to see that, to recognize the face was too much, was too painful, too difficult, too problematic, that it almost blocked it. Because in reality, she saw it. This is the explanation that I'm trying to get to. She saw the face, but her brain or the hippocampus kind of almost saying, no, you didn't, or kind of like trying to, like a distorted image because it was just too much to know that it was a family member that was doing that to her. So having done, you know, many EMDR sessions, and now with this understanding of what I'm doing with the brain, it makes a lot of sense. And the good thing is that now we are understanding. So next week or next time, we're going to continue to go through. So far we only have 2 of the main 5. What are the 2 main parts of the brain that we covered so far? One is
Hippocampus.
the hippocampus.
Amygdala and hippocampus.
Yeah, the amygdala and the hippocampus. So we also cover the thalamus and the hypothalamus and the cortex, but they're not so significant when it comes to the limbic system. So the next training is going to take us to the remaining of the main areas of the limbic system, which has to do with the body sensation. Because, you know, as we're going to learn, the insula is the one that gives you all the body sensations. And we're going to learn about the other three structures and why the body has the tingling sensation, the numbness, or all the different physiological changes that happen when the SNS gets activated. All right, so anything else before we pause the recording? Anything else that you want to say? Valerie, is this training adding to your training or to your knowledge, or how are you perceiving the training that you're going through so far?
I really like it. I was going to add to with Praxedis right now, because I'm in like that limbo of, okay, I have these 10 sessions with Consulado and I don't know about victims of crime yet. I was like, what, like basically like symptom reduction and trying to like get through there. So I'm like, okay, how do I help you like now? Like, let's say we only have the 10 sessions, like what do we do now? And so she was like, we were doing coping skills and whatnot. And she was like, but really, I think I just need to just like process a lot of what happened. And I was like, because she said there's been a lot of stuff. It's not just the domestic violence, because she's also like had difficulties with immigration and stuff like that. And so she was like, when I talk to other people, they asked me like, why can't you just get over it? Why can't you get over it? And I basically was doing psycho ed with her of, well, there was a purpose to remembering all of those things that happened to you. And when I put it like that, then she was like, oh yeah, I didn't think about that. So just like explaining that part to her and like wanting to get her to the point of not being so like emotionally, not having that emotional reaction to talking about those things. Because like through this training, I'm like, okay, yeah, that's what she needs to happen, is to not be so like emotionally aroused when remembering those things.
Excellent.
tricky.
Very good. And the idea that you take this training and kind of put it into practice in clinical practice, because that's what we're trying to do. So one of the things that to me in practice, and again, we're going to have videos, you know, about this. And when I talk to clients about these neural networks that continue to impact their mood, their emotional well-being, their thought process, it makes a lot of sense. It's almost a formal normalizing what they're going through. It's like saying, like, remember, it's a normal reaction to something that was abnormal. You were not supposed to be hurt. You were not supposed to be abused. You were not supposed to be, hurt like that. So it's normal. So it's a part of the psycho ed about the body is doing what it needs to do. It's reacting like it's what that is. A lot of the clients come with a lot of self-critical thinking. A lot of them have very self-defeating ideas, because I'm weak, because I blame myself because of this or that. And this is a way of saying, no, this is what's happening to you is normal. It's like something that the body has to go through when something like this happens to a victim. So it's a way for them to be less critical and to be more understanding and compassionate about themselves, and being hopeful that if they continue this process, that things are going to get better. So that's kind of like how we take this information into psycho ed, into different interventions, into what we're trying to do for them to continue their healing process. So,
I was going to ask you too, do they do like trainings like this in Spanish? Because I'm like, how do I say these words in Spanish?
yeah, and
Okay.
we're going to be looking into that. I know that we have the neuroplasticity, we have them in Spanish. We're going to be, when we develop the virtual office that I was explaining, we're going to have a section in Spanish where you can just walk in and grab whatever you feel is appropriate at that time. So we're going to stop the recording here. Stop recording.